They said, "She won't remember anyway." I heard it through the thin curtain, the one they pulled halfway, as if my hearing had declined alongside my memory. I was lying there, in that white bed with the stiff sheets and the sour smell of antiseptic, and I remember thinking how efficiently cruelty can disguise itself as kindness. My wristband said Marjorie in thick black letters, as though I needed reminding who I was. I didn't answer. I didn't call out. I just stared at the ceiling tile above my head, the one with a faint brown stain shaped like a continent, and thought, so that's what they think I am now, someone who forgets conveniently. I am 82 years old, and I remember everything. The names, the faces, the order of things, the details they thought time would erase. The blue cardigan I wore the day they took me from my house. The chipped porcelain mug on the kitchen counter I never got to wash. The smell of wet leaves outside as the ambulance doors closed. I remember my daughter's face leaning over me, rehearsed concern covering the calculation underneath. I remember my son-in-law's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, as if they were performing parental piety for some invisible audience. I remember the nurse, young and nervous, reading from a chart. "Mrs. Layton, your daughter and son-in-law have made arrangements for continued care." Continued care. That was the phrase. It sounded so neutral, so procedural, so unlike what it meant. It began, as these things often do, with something small enough to justify itself. A fall. Nothing dramatic. I tripped over the corner of a rug in my kitchen, and though the pain was sharp, it was my pride that bruised deeper. I went to the hospital because they insisted, and I stayed because they decided. It was meant to be overnight, a precaution. I remember my daughter's voice on the phone with the insurance office, low and deliberate, spelling my name with that clipped authority that comes easily to people who have power and don't like to waste it. She used the word placement more than once. "She'll be safe there," she said. "She won't remember much anyway." The hospital room was small, and the air smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. Nurses came and went like cautious ghosts, their kindness automatic. I was polite in return. That's what I was raised to be. Pleasant, undemanding, a woman who doesn't cause trouble. I let them take my vitals, let them spoon gelatin into a bowl I didn't want, let them wheel me down hallways lined with paintings of flowers that looked nothing like real ones. I didn't fight when they said I'd be transferred for rehabilitation. It wasn't until the elevator doors opened on a different floor and I saw the sign, Evergreen Residence for Assisted Living, that I realized rehabilitation had been a euphemism. I remember the way my daughter avoided my eyes as she signed the clipboard, the way she squeezed my hand like she was steadying me, when really she was anchoring her guilt. The first night there, I couldn't sleep. The lights in the hallway never went fully dark, and every few minutes a cart rolled past, squeaking faintly, carrying medication cups and whispers. My roommate, a woman named Evelyn, snored softly with the resigned rhythm of someone who had stopped keeping count of years. I lay awake, my hands folded on the blanket, thinking about my house, the floral curtains I'd sewn myself, the bookshelves lined with photographs, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen that had sounded like company on lonely evenings. I thought about how my daughter had stood in that same kitchen 3 days earlier, telling me not to worry. "Just rest, Mom. We'll handle everything." I remember how relieved I'd felt at those words. I thought she meant the mail, the bills, the errands. I didn't realize she meant my life. They visited 3 days later, walking in together with matching concerned expressions and takeaway coffees in hand. "How are you settling in?" my daughter asked brightly, as though I were a student at summer camp. I told her the food was fine, the staff polite. She smiled with practiced satisfaction. "See, I told you it would be good for you." She said it like a woman who'd completed a difficult but necessary task. My son-in-law lingered near the door, scrolling on his phone. He didn't look at me when he said, "They've got you in good hands here, Marjorie." I remember thinking how strange it was to hear my name from his mouth. He usually called me Ma. It was distance disguised as formality. When they left, my daughter hugged me quickly and whispered, "Try not to overthink things, okay?" Then she was gone. I wasn't angry then, not yet. I was suspended in a kind of stunned quiet, the kind that comes after betrayal, but before comprehension. It's a fragile space, that gap between what you thought you knew and what you suddenly understand. I spent hours in the common room, watching muted television shows and listening to the other residents talk about grandchildren who never came. One woman, Iris, liked to hold my hand during mealtimes. "They think we're fading," she said once, her voice dry as paper. "But memory's a stubborn thing. It holds on in places they can't reach." I nodded. I was holding on too. Weeks passed. I pretended to settle in. I played the role they'd written for me, the grateful, docile patient. I smiled for the staff, said thank you when they changed my sheets, laughed softly when they called me sweetheart. But inside, a quiet calculation was unfolding. I began to notice details, the way my daughter's name appeared as guardian on my file, the way the staff referred to her when confirming any request, even small ones, as if I were a minor under supervision. My mail was delivered to her address. My pension account had been redirected. They had turned me into a dependent and then congratulated themselves for providing care. The indignity wasn't loud. It was bureaucratic, subtle, efficient. Every form signed on my behalf was another thread cut from the fabric of my independence. Yet, ironically, it was that very efficiency that gave me space to think, to remember, to plan. Because they believed I was too confused to notice, no one paid much attention when I asked the nurse what day it was, or what city the hospital had filed its legal paperwork in. No one noticed when I asked for a copy of my records for my daughter's scrapbook. They didn't see that I was mapping their system quietly, the way one learns the rhythm of tides before building a raft. Memory isn't a perfect thing. It wavers, it distorts, but it can also sharpen under pressure, like glass under flame. I began to remember small, potent things. The name of the lawyer who had helped me write my first will after my husband died. The number of the bank where I'd once held an account in my maiden name. The address of the house I'd sold 30 years ago, but still knew by heart. These fragments felt like keys turning in forgotten locks. I wasn't senile. I was simply waiting for a moment to prove I wasn't. One evening, a nurse named Clara came to check my blood pressure. She was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and a kindness that hadn't yet been trained out of her. As she wrapped the cuff around my arm, she said softly, "Your daughter's been calling every day. She says you're not answering when she visits." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just remembering at inconvenient times," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, as though realizing something unspoken. Later that night, when the halls were quiet and the light from the vending machine cast a soft glow across the linoleum, she slipped a small cell phone into the drawer of my bedside table. "In case you ever need to remember a number," she whispered. I stared at that phone for a long time after she left. I could have cried, but I didn't. Instead, I opened it, dialed a number I hadn't used in years, and waited through 2 rings. A man's voice answered, roughened by time but unmistakable. "Marjorie," he said, as if I'd just walked out of the past. "It's me," I replied. "I need to remember something, and I need it written down properly." That was the night I stopped being the woman they thought I'd become, the forgetful, manageable patient, and became someone else entirely. The next morning, I folded my hands neatly on my lap as the aides wheeled me to breakfast, smiling the small, patient smile of someone who knows more than she should. I had begun to rewrite my story quietly, from the inside out. And so, when people now say that old age erases, that memory is mercy, I think of that sterile white room, of their whisper, "She won't remember anyway." And I almost laugh. I did remember. Every word, every look, every document. I remembered enough to find my way back to myself. And that, I've learned, is the most dangerous thing an old woman can do. It happened 3 weeks after the hospital discharged me, though no one asked if I wanted to be discharged where they sent me. They called it continuity of care, as if I were an appointment being handed from one desk to another. I woke to the sound of rubber soles squeaking on the floor, 2 orderlies in light blue scrubs standing at the foot of my bed, one of them holding a clipboard. They spoke to each other rather than to me, discussing transport, authorizations, dietary notes, the way men might discuss the movement of furniture. When I asked where I was going, one of them smiled the way people do at children who ask too many questions and said, "Don't you worry, Mrs. Layton. Your daughter arranged everything." Those were the first words of the betrayal, dressed in the soft fabric of reassurance. My daughter arrived 10 minutes later with coffee in one hand and my handbag in the other. She wore her efficient face, the one she'd perfected over years of being the reliable professional, the woman who could solve problems without showing fatigue. "Mom, I know you're tired of hospitals," she began, as though she were granting me a favor. "We found you a place that's quieter, more comfortable. They'll help you get back on your feet." I remember looking at her, trying to find my daughter inside the corporate language she used. "A place?" I asked. "What kind of place?" She brushed the question aside. "You'll see. It's very nice." My son-in-law appeared behind her, pretending to check his watch. They always moved in tandem, like synchronized actors performing competence. I felt small in that bed, wearing the gown that didn't close properly at the back, surrounded by people making decisions about my body as if I weren't in it. I wanted to say, "I can go home. My legs work. My house is paid for. My mind is still mine." But the words jammed somewhere between my chest and my throat because I already knew they wouldn't listen. The ambulance ride was long, and the driver had the radio on low, some country song about home and heartbreak. My daughter followed in her car, or at least that's what they told me. When we arrived, the building rose before me like an imitation of comfort, brick walls the color of oatmeal, windows trimmed with white paint, a neat sign reading, "The Willows, Residential Care with Compassion." The word compassion had been printed in italics, as if style could make it more believable. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and artificial lavender. A receptionist greeted us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and handed my daughter a stack of forms. "Just signatures on the highlighted lines," she said cheerfully. My daughter signed without reading. She'd done her research, she said. She trusted the process. The process, another word that meant surrender. I tried to keep my breathing steady as they led me down a hallway that buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past residents smiling at picnics or painting in groups. They all looked so content that I wondered whether the camera caught them before or after they'd realized what had happened to their lives. In my room, the bed was made neatly, the nightstand bare, except for a laminated list of daily activities that included things like chair yoga, sing-alongs, and reminiscence hour. I laughed out loud at that. An hour allotted for memory, as if recollection were something that needed scheduling. My daughter mistook my laugh for approval and clapped her hands lightly. See? It's cozy. She placed my handbag on the dresser, kissed my cheek too quickly, and said she'd return in a few days to check on me. I watched her walk out the door, her heels clicking down the corridor like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence I hadn't written. The last thing I heard her say to the nurse at the desk was, "She won't remember much of this anyway." When the door closed, the silence felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall where a painting should have been. I felt the shape of my house pressing against the inside of my chest, the smell of the wooden floors after I polished them, the low hum of the kettle, the framed photographs of my husband on the bookshelf. I had left all of it behind, though I hadn't chosen to. I opened my handbag, hoping to find my phone, but it was gone. My daughter had taken it for safekeeping, she said. I knew what that meant. It meant control. It meant silence. I found only a single folded note inside the side pocket, a list of my medications in my daughter's handwriting, and the words, "Love you. Rest easy." It looked more like an instruction than affection. Dinner was served on plastic trays, the food bland and colorless. Across the table, a woman with white curls introduced herself as Ruth. She was 86 and wore a necklace shaped like a locket. "You knew?" she asked, squinting. "Yes," I said. "I'm not sure for how long." She chuckled softly. "None of us are." Her laughter was the first human sound that didn't feel scripted. She told me she used to be a teacher, then paused, frowned, and said, "I think." I nodded gently. We ate in silence after that. When the aides came to collect the trays, one of them called me dear and asked if I needed help getting to bed. I told her I could walk. She looked surprised, as if that were a defiance. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, and somewhere down the hall, someone was crying softly into the dark. I thought about what my daughter had said. "You'll be safe here." Safe from what, I wondered? From falling, from loneliness, from being inconvenient, or safe for her, from responsibility, from guilt, from the messy reminder that mothers age and die and sometimes remember too much. I turned on my side and stared at the narrow window. The curtain fluttered faintly with the hum of the central air. I whispered my own name, just to hear it, to make sure it still sounded like me. In the morning, I asked the nurse for my discharge papers, pretending I didn't understand the system. "Oh, Mrs. Layton," she said with a kind of condescending pity, "you're not here for discharge. You're here for long-term recovery." I asked who had decided that. She smiled as if the answer were self-evident. "Your family, dear. They just want what's best for you." Best for me had become the most dangerous phrase in the language. I wanted to ask how many other people in that building were living someone else's version of best. Instead, I nodded and thanked her for her kindness. I learned long ago that resistance works best when it looks like compliance. Days blurred together after that. The staff moved with brisk efficiency, addressing us by first names, but not with any real familiarity. We became part of the routine, the morning meds, the vitals, the meal rounds, the laundry collection, the group activities. I started to notice how some residents stopped speaking altogether, as though silence were contagious. Others repeated phrases to themselves in loops, small mantras of survival. It's nice here, isn't it? They take good care of us. We're lucky. I wanted to tell them that luck had nothing to do with it. I wanted to stand in the hallway and shout, "We are not furniture." But I didn't. Not yet. I was waiting for something I couldn't yet name. Then one afternoon, during visiting hours, I saw my daughter again. She brought flowers, lilies, too fragrant for the small room, and a folder tucked under her arm. She arranged the lilies in a vase with exaggerated care, avoiding my eyes. "How's it going, Mom?" she asked, her tone bright and brittle. I told her it was quiet. "That's good," she said, sitting at the edge of the bed. "You need calm." She opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "These are just updates," she said lightly. "Insurance, power of attorney, boring things. You don't need to worry." I looked at the paper and saw my own signature already printed at the bottom. My daughter's handwriting filled the rest. "When did I sign this?" I asked. She smiled. "Oh, remember at the hospital? You were still groggy. The nurse brought the clipboard." She said it like a trivial detail, like a favor done in haste. My stomach turned cold. "You said it was temporary," I whispered. "It is," she said quickly, "just until you're stronger." Then she patted my hand, the way one might calm an animal, and changed the subject. After she left, I sat for a long time staring at the paper. The words were heavy with legal phrasing: authorized representative, continuing guardianship, medical consent. Each one chipped away at me. They had made me into a dependent, a ward, a possession. I realized then that the betrayal had not been the transfer itself, but the assumption behind it, the quiet collective decision that my will no longer mattered. I folded the paper and slid it under my pillow. If they thought I wouldn't remember, they were wrong. That night, I heard Ruth crying in her bed. I reached over and took her hand, thin and cold, and whispered, "They think we're gone, but we're still here." She didn't answer, but her hand tightened around mine. Somewhere beyond the walls, I heard the faint sound of rain tapping against the glass, and it struck me that I hadn't seen the sky in days. That was the moment something shifted, not anger yet, but the beginning of it, a slow, deliberate awakening. I would not be erased quietly. I would not be the woman they described in polite tones to social workers and neighbors. I would remember, and I would make sure someone else remembered too. The next morning, when the nurse brought my breakfast, I smiled and asked if she could tell me where the mail was sent for residents. She hesitated, then said, "Usually to their families." I nodded as if it were fine. Later, when she left, I took a pen from her cart and wrote one sentence on the back of the folded paper. "I know what you did." I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but it felt good to see it written, proof that I could still name a wrong. The betrayal was complete, yes, but so was the first outline of my resistance. They didn't have to raise their voices to make the world smaller. They did it with laminated schedules, with the lilting way they bent my name into something soft and manageable, with the clipboard that always arrived before breakfast so that consent felt like routine rather than choice. And soon the days began to take on the texture of felt, dull at the edges, clinging to whatever pressed against them, leaving threads behind when you tried to pull away. The aides learned my preferences by skimming the chart rather than speaking to me, so suddenly my tea arrived sugared because the note said, "Prefers sweetened," though I had never taken sugar in anything. My cardigan disappeared into laundry that came back smelling of someone else's perfume. My hair, which I had always parted on the left, emerged from the bath neatly combed to the right, as if the direction of memory could be reversed with enough passes of a plastic brush. When I asked where my house keys were, my daughter said lightly that she had tucked them somewhere safe. And when I asked where safe was, she laughed a little and said, "In a place you won't forget," which meant, of course, unreachable, like the sky through a window that didn't open. The quiet worsened in ways that would sound petty to anyone who has never been managed for their own good. The television remote in the common room was sheathed in a rubber sleeve and locked to 3 channels pre-selected for wholesome content. The afternoon news removed because it upset some residents, which meant we learned about the outside world only through a floating caption at the bottom of a morning show that played the same recipe segment twice. The courtyard door required a code that only staff knew, and the staff were always too busy to walk anyone out, which transformed fresh air into a privilege reserved for the efficient. The activity board promised Scrabble and current events, and both were replaced, more often than not, with sing-alongs from someone else's childhood, while the stack of newspapers in the corner turned out to be last week's, arranged with the deliberate optimism of a stage set. I kept notes in my head because paper went missing, and I discovered that when an old woman does not write anything down, she is assumed to be at peace rather than vigilant. Vigilance is a private occupation in places like these, an art practiced in the space between the pill cup and the swallow, in the small breath you take before answering the nurse who calls you sweetheart, while tightening the Velcro strap on your chair, just in case. My chart began to gather adjectives, each one carefully neutral, each one tilting the room. Mild confusion at sundown, it said, because I dared to ask for the time after dinner. Resistant to showering, because I preferred mornings to evenings and wanted the curtain closed fully rather than half. Impulsive, because I stood without asking when I recognized Clara's footsteps and wished to greet the only person who addressed me by my full name and waited for my answer. The wristband they replaced after my bath was colored yellow rather than white, which meant fall risk, which meant that the bed sprouted an alarm that cried out when my feet met the floor, which meant that night turned into a negotiation with a machine that sought proof I could be trusted with my own weight. There is a humiliation that comes with proving ordinary competence on a schedule designed to preempt it. When the aide asked whether I had eliminated, and I said, "Yes, just now," she pursed her lips as if I had cheated on a test, then made a note to increase reminders, and it is astonishing how quickly a reminder becomes a leash when the person holding it is in a hurry and the person wearing it has nowhere else to go. My daughter's visits became demonstrations rather than conversations, each one staged for whichever professional could be summoned to the doorway to witness her concern. She arrived with folded tops I would never have chosen and said she'd found them on sale, placed a framed photo of her own family on my nightstand, and told me how much the children missed me while never proposing a time to bring them. Spoke in a voice pitched slightly too loud and a tempo slightly too quick, a tempo that said the clock was always on her side. Once, she asked me to sign a birthday card for a cousin I barely knew, just to keep you connected, and slipped another paper beneath it so quickly that I signed the card and then looked down to find my tremored name also affixed to a communication plan that routed calls through her. I smiled the way women smile when they've been backed through a doorway and offered a chair, sat, and bided. She told the social worker that I was doing so well, and I watched the social worker pencil in appears to thrive in structure, and later, when I asked the desk for a copy of my own care plan, the clerk suggested I have my guardian request it, because the person who lives the life will always be the last to read the rules. Ruth, who had the hands of a pianist and the kind of locket that hides more than it displays, began to forget the names for ordinary things, and the staff addressed her in the past tense while she sat there very much present, so that I learned what it feels like to be erased in front of the body that remembers you. They told her, within her hearing, that she used to be a teacher and used to walk to the park, as if the use of the past would sweep the present into compliance, as if tense were destiny rather than grammar. In the dining room, the salt shakers disappeared one afternoon, per dietary directive, and the food turned softer and paler, and choices narrowed until lunch became chicken or fish, both steamed into a sameness that suggested the kitchen believed texture was an aggression. When I asked for pepper, the aide laughed and said, "Spicy lady," and wrote "monitor preferences" in a margin, and I discovered that asking for taste can be framed as misbehavior when appetite itself is suspicious. My paperback vanished, and when it returned it smelled of bleach. Its pages buckled. The sentences rippled into a topography that gave even familiar paragraphs the slur of a dream, and I learned to memorize poems while waiting for my laundry, because recitation is a kind of ownership that no one can inventory. At night, the hallway speakers played the same loop of piano music, the volume sliding up and down like breath, and somewhere around 2 a.m, the automated voice would announce "Code Gray" or "Staff to Unit 2," and then the voices would hurry past, and the doors would click, and the building would remember itself as a system rather than a home. On those nights, Evelyn, my first roommate, was moved without warning to a different floor for observation, and a woman named June appeared in her place by dawn, clutching a stuffed dog and asking in a whisper whether this was the bus station, and I sat up and told her gently that it was morning, that someone would bring tea, that we were not traveling today, while making a note in my mind that people vanish here between the last pill of one day and the first pill of the next, and no one mentions it at breakfast, because absences are accounted for in staff huddles, and that suffices. I kept the phone that Clara had slipped me wrapped in a handkerchief, battery off, screen spotless, a secret thing that existed the way a tide does, reliable and private, and sometimes I would take it out at noon and hold it flat on my lap beneath the blanket while pretending to nap, not to call anyone, not yet, but to remind myself that the world could be summoned in a series of numbers I still knew by heart, that my hands remembered the choreography of choice. The social worker who liked clipboards more than eyes asked me whether I felt engaged, and I said I was practicing French with an app in my head, which she did not hear as a joke or a rebellion, but as confusion, and she added, "reality orientation beneficial to my file," which meant the aides began to checkpoint me with questions like, "What season is it?" and "Who is the president?" And I answered with such clarity that they smiled and said, "Good job," and wrote, "Responds well to cues." And I understood that excellence here earns you more tests, not more freedom. The first time I asked to sign myself out for a walk, the nurse explained that liability prevented it, that my daughter would need to accompany me, and when I pointed out that my daughter could scarcely find an hour that wasn't already pledged to someone else's impression of her, the nurse offered me a brochure about guided reminiscent strolls, in which a volunteer narrates the trees as if the resident had never seen leaves, and I discovered a new and particular rage that no longer burned but calcified, a bone-deep refusal that made my voice inescapably calm. Clara, who learned to lean her hip against the door jamb so she could pretend to be adjusting the blinds when really she was speaking to me like a person rather than a task, started to arrive with bits of the outside tucked into her pockets, a flyer for a community poetry reading, a receipt from a bakery with the scent of cinnamon still clinging to it, a strip of photos from a booth where she and a friend had made faces, proof that Wim existed 15 minutes down the road, and also proof that Wim never enters a care plan. She told me that the communication plan could be reversed with a simple written request from me, but that the request would be routed through my daughter for verification, which was like saying a locked door could be opened by the person holding the key if only you wrote them a letter describing the door. So I began my own little archive, dates of calls I had not received, names of aides who spoke to me in the third person, wording on signs that governed our hours, tiny entries on a mental index card that I kept in the pocket of my patients because I understood that memory would be my affidavit, and that affidavits matter most when delivered without tremor. Mail day revealed the shape of the trap with unusual clarity. A glossy envelope arrived addressed to my daughter at her home with a return address from my bank, and she opened it in front of me and said, "Nothing urgent," and slid it into her tote. And when I asked if I might see it, she said, "Of course, later," and later receded toward a horizon that never curved back. The next week, a postcard came from an old neighbor with a photograph of the rhododendrons in bloom, and the receptionist set it aside to be reviewed, and by the time it reached my hand, the season had turned. I learned that my utilities had been suspended to save you money, that the gardener had been told to stop coming, that the spare key under the bird bath no longer opened anything because the locks had been changed for safety. And I sat very still and studied the tilt of my daughter's chin when she reported each of these as kindnesses. And I realized the first escalation is not a shout. It is a series of clicks, lock, 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 performed by someone who calls you mom while removing every object that ever made you sovereign. By then, the aides called me the reader and sometimes asked me to help with menus because I could decipher the tiny print without squinting, and I used the opportunity to circle things with actual flavor for the people who had forgotten how to ask, which made me briefly feel useful in a way that didn't reduce me to a schedule. Usefulness is a narcotic in such places. It blurs the outline of the cage, and I used the clarity it brought to plan the next inch. I practiced walking the length of the corridor with my hands clasped behind my back so the cameras would not interpret my balance as reach, timed the medication rounds so I knew when the desk was least crowded, watched which nurses wore lanyards heavy with keys and which carried only pens, and I trained myself to stop explaining, because explanation is the luxury of people who aren't being documented. When Clara slipped me a tiny spiral notepad, by mistake, I did not write a single word in it. Instead, I tore out one page, folded it twice, and tucked it inside the pillowcase over the shape of that earlier document with my stolen signature, because sometimes the only letter you can send is the one you promise yourself, a pledge with no stamp that nevertheless moves you forward. The day they added wandering to my chart because I paused, unescorted, by the window for longer than a nurse wished me to, I felt the floor steady rather than tilt. I realized that every escalated label would justify the next restraint, that the building would keep teaching itself who I was until the lesson stuck, and that I would either accept the definition or write a countertext in the oldest ink left to me, my memory and my timing. So I started to rehearse aloud the names and numbers I might need, but I did it in the guise of practicing a poem, and when the aide praised my recall, I smiled and asked for pepper, and when she laughed and said, "Spicy lady," I thought, yes, and set the empty shaker back on the table with a care I reserved for flammable things. At night, after the piano loop faded and the alarm on my bed had been disarmed by Clara, by accident, I lay very still and pictured my front door as it had been, blue with a tiny dent where my husband's bicycle had once leaned, and I told myself that doors are only closed in one direction at a time, that a hinge is a promise as much as a limit, and that the first escalation is survivable if you refuse to let your interior vocabulary be replaced. So the days lengthened the way winters do, cold settling not from a single storm, but from a season's insistence, and in that season I learned how to keep warm with friction, rubbing one memory against another until a small heat formed, enough to see the next step. They would move the furniture of my life. They would set out the acceptable cups and take away the salt. They would name me for their convenience and ask me to nod along. And I, who used to apologize to kettles for boiling over, began to speak gently and with great care, because when you are being filed, you must never raise your voice. You must never give them a sentence they can quote instead of a life they must witness. And above all, you must not forget that forgetting is what they want from you, not what time insists upon. I did not forget. I learned the whole shape of their quiet, and then I began to press against it, not with noise, not yet, but with the patience of a tide that clocks the moon and waits. The change began without announcement, the way a season shifts when you are too busy counting the days to notice the light has altered its angle. And one afternoon, I realized that I had stopped waiting for rescue. Waiting had been the institution's true currency. Every gesture from staff, every visit from family, every form, every tray, every apology for a delay trained us to expect deliverance from elsewhere. But there came a day when the waiting itself snapped, quietly, like an overused hinge. It was late October, and the air in the corridor carried that faint metallic chill that signals the world outside is beginning to harden into winter. I had been at the Willows for 2 months by then, long enough to know the rhythm of every squeaky wheel, the sigh of each closing door, the footfall of every nurse. I could tell who was approaching my room by the cadence of their keys alone. That was how small my world had become, its music reduced to footsteps and keys. Yet within that shrinking perimeter, something stubborn had started to bloom. It was Clara who gave it shape. She had been avoiding me for a week, perhaps warned that her attentiveness exceeded professional boundaries. And then one evening, she appeared at my door with a clipboard in hand and that careful air of pretending to perform a task. "Just need to check your vitals," she said, though the shift doctor had done rounds an hour earlier. I offered my arm without a word. When the cuff released its sigh, she leaned in slightly and whispered, "You're listed as moderate cognitive decline now. That means they'll start talking about advanced care plans." I looked at her, trying not to betray the spark of fear or fury. "And that means what exactly?" I asked softly. She hesitated, eyes on the numbers flashing on the machine. "It means they can make certain medical decisions without asking you first, especially if your daughter signs." She straightened, gathering her chart. "I thought you should know." Then she slipped a folded paper under my blanket and left before I could speak. When I unfolded it later, it was a printout from the state's Elder Rights Office, outlining how a power of attorney could be contested if there was proof of cognitive competence and undue influence. At the bottom, in Clara's handwriting, was a note. "Call this number. Ask for Dean Hollis. He owes me a favor." The phone she had given me still rested in its hiding place, wrapped in a handkerchief. I charged it during laundry hour, when everyone was too busy folding sheets to notice an extra wire trailing from the socket near the vending machine. My hands shook as I dialed. The voice that answered was male, clipped, professional, but not unkind. "Hollis," he said, I was told to expect your call." I hadn't said my name yet, but perhaps Clara had prepared him. I told him briefly what had happened, that I was competent, that I had been moved without consent, that my daughter controlled my finances and mail. He asked questions, slow and deliberate. Did I have identification? Could I sign my name clearly? Did I have access to any personal bank account untouched by my daughter's authority? To each, I answered yes, and with every yes, I felt the line tighten into something solid. "Then you can still act," he said. "If you wish to change your power of attorney or rewrite your will, you can do so immediately. The law requires that I or another witness verify your mental state, but that's procedural. The challenge will be getting the documents to you privately." I told him that I could manage privacy. I had mastered invisibility, after all. 2 days later, he arrived posing as a volunteer for the Life Stories program. The receptionist signed him in with the casual smile she reserved for harmless visitors who did not demand attention. He carried a clipboard and a worn leather bag, and when he entered my room, he said loudly, "I'm here to record Mrs. Layton's memories for the community archive." I nodded, grateful for his improvisation. Once the door closed, he lowered his voice and opened the bag. Inside were several forms, a recorder, and a small legal pad. "I'm not your lawyer," he said, "but I can notarize. Clara briefed me. You'll need to sign in my presence. Read everything first." His tone was brisk but respectful, the tone of a man who understands that urgency can coexist with dignity. I read slowly, tracing each line with my finger, savoring the return of comprehension as power rather than test. The new will was brief and unmistakably mine. I left a small trust for Clara, a modest donation to the public library, where I had volunteered for 20 years, and the rest, what little there was, to be divided among organizations that helped women fight guardianship abuse. My daughter's name appeared only once, next to a note that read, "Executor removed at principal's request." When I signed, my hand trembled not from age, but from the thrill of reversal. The pen felt heavier than any gavel. Dean witnessed, stamped, and slipped the papers into a folder that looked like a stack of community flyers. "Keep this copy hidden," he said. "I'll file the original. You'll get confirmation by mail within 2 weeks." He paused before leaving. "You're the second person this month from that facility to call." That detail pierced me more deeply than I expected. I wasn't the only one quietly fighting the erasure. When he left, I hid the copy behind the lining of my pillow, then sat for a long time staring at the door, half expecting the air itself to sound an alarm. Nothing happened. The building hummed on, oblivious. The next morning, breakfast arrived with the usual plastic smile of routine. Oatmeal, tea, no salt. I ate slowly, savoring each bite like a private ritual. For the first time since arriving, the blandness did not humiliate me. It freed me, because I knew I had acted while they believed me dormant. My daughter visited later that week, wearing a cashmere coat and the scent of a perfume that had always made me think of sealed elevators. She spoke about my progress, about the nice remarks the staff made, about how she was planning to sell my house to simplify things. She used that word, simplify, as if my life were a cluttered drawer. I listened, calm, almost detached, knowing that my signature had already severed her authority. When she finished her performance and rose to leave, she leaned down and kissed my forehead. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "Just keep trusting us." I smiled faintly. "I always do," I said, and she mistook the tone for surrender. That night, as I lay awake listening to the radiator's sigh, a memory surfaced of the summer after my husband died, when I learned to drive alone for the first time at 53. The fear had been immense, a kind of trembling in the stomach that felt both foolish and monumental. But the moment I turned the key and felt the car respond, a strange calm took hold. That was how I felt now, engine humming quietly under the ribs, direction mine again. I began to take longer walks down the corridor, pausing by the exit door where sunlight leaked through the glass. The aides, assuming I was restless from confusion, offered to wheel me outside for a few minutes of air. I declined politely. I didn't want borrowed air. I wanted ownership. Ruth's condition worsened, and one morning her bed was stripped bare, her belongings folded into a plastic bag. "Transferred," a nurse said vaguely. I understood. The room felt hollow without her. That emptiness spurred me to act. I began helping another resident, June, the one with the stuffed dog, write letters to her son. She dictated slowly, haltingly, forgetting dates and names, and I filled the blanks with kindness. We never knew if the letters were mailed, but writing them made her smile, and it reminded me that the written word still traveled beyond these walls, whether by post or memory. A week later, Dean's confirmation arrived. The receptionist handed me an envelope without curiosity. "From a community foundation," she said. Inside was a brief note. "Documents filed. Keep the copy safe. No further action required unless challenged." I read it twice, then tore it into small pieces and flushed them, because evidence can be as dangerous as neglect. That night I slept without the alarm of the bed engaged, Clara's quiet rebellion again disguised as oversight, and in the gentle dark I felt a stillness that was not emptiness, but arrival, the midpoint between loss and reclamation, the precise moment when you realize the worst has already been done to you, and therefore you are free to imagine what comes after. The next day, a new resident moved into Ruth's old bed. Her name was Teresa, a retired nurse with a raspy voice and an irreverent sense of humor. She recognized the system for what it was within hours. "You give them obedience, they give you safety," she said. "You give them silence, they call it gratitude. It's a bad trade." We became companions in quiet subversion, swapping our untouched desserts for contraband coffee packets, sharing stories and whispers that grew bolder with each telling. It wasn't friendship in the traditional sense. It was alliance, born of mutual clarity. Soon after, the administrator announced that due to increased cognitive decline metrics, the facility would limit residents' phone access to supervised calls. I felt a flicker of panic before remembering that my secret phone was still hidden, its battery now charged and waiting. Power, I learned, does not always roar. It hums. It hums in drawers, in signatures, in the knowledge that your will bears your handwriting and not someone else's. One evening, Teresa asked me what I would do if I could walk out. The question caught me off guard. I had been so consumed with the mechanics of survival that I hadn't dared imagine freedom in concrete terms. "I'd find a place by water," I said slowly. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere I can hear the wind and not be accounted for." She smiled, eyes bright with mischief. "Then start saving for a bus ticket, sweetheart." Her calling me that word turned it into something real again, stripped of condescension. For the first time in months, I laughed, a full laugh that startled even me. That night, I wrote a list in the notepad Clara had given me. It wasn't a plan exactly, more like a map of possibilities. Call the bank, retrieve ID, request pension redirection, check bus routes. Each item felt like a heartbeat. When I finished, I tucked the pad beneath the mattress and whispered to myself, "I am not done yet." It wasn't defiance. It was declaration. Outside, a storm was gathering, wind rattling the window panes. I stood by the glass, watching leaves swirl like restless souls, and I realized that the first half of my captivity had been about erasure, but the second would be about authorship. They could chart my blood pressure, my mood, my meals, but they could not chart what I decided to remember or whom I chose to become. The shift was complete, not a blaze, but a turning, a recalibration of gravity. I was still in the same bed, under the same fluorescent hum, yet the weight of my body belonged to me again. And so, as the thunder rolled faintly in the distance, I whispered a small vow to the window. They think I will forget. I will make forgetting impossible. That night I slept deeply, dreamless and steady, as if the world itself had paused to witness an old woman reclaiming the authorship of her story. The trouble always begins when someone notices you are too calm. Institutions are built to absorb despair and tantrums, but they have no protocol for composure. A quietly lucid woman unsettles the pattern, and soon after Dean's letter arrived and the nights began to lengthen into early winter, the staff's tone toward me shifted again. Not harsher exactly, but watchful, as though they suspected I was harboring an unsanctioned clarity. The head nurse started asking if I remembered to take my medication, though I had never once missed a dose. My daughter's visits became less frequent, but heavier with authority. She would stride into the room with a tablet in her hand, announce a list of updates about my care, and then pivot to some small, intimate question meant to sound affectionate. Have you been eating enough fruit? Or, did you ever find that blue sweater you liked? And the juxtaposition of her corporate tone with these counterfeit tendernesses exhausted me more than anger ever could. She had developed a way of speaking that left no room for interruption, each sentence a small closure. When she smiled, it looked like she was checking an item off a list. It was in December that the confrontation took root. A letter arrived addressed to me but opened already, the flap neatly sliced. Inside was a notice from the county clerk confirming that my revised will had been filed and that my power of attorney had been revoked. Someone, my daughter, I assumed, had intercepted it, read it, and then placed it on my tray, perhaps to gauge my reaction. My heart thudded once, sharply. There was no use pretending she wouldn't discover it. The legal changes were a matter of record. I folded the letter and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. And when she came that afternoon, her face carried that brittle politeness of someone containing fury. She began with pleasantries about the weather, about how festive the dining room looked, about how proud she was that I had participated in the holiday craft session, though I hadn't. Then, abruptly, she set her tablet on the bed and said, "Mom, we need to talk about what you've been doing." Her voice trembled at the edges, not sadness, but disbelief that her control might no longer be total. I told her I didn't understand. She turned the tablet around to show me a document, the digital record of the new will. "This," she said, "this isn't right. You couldn't have done this of your own accord. Someone took advantage of you," I asked very gently. "Do you think I'm incapable of signing my name?" She hesitated, eyes narrowing. "Mom, you're 82. You're not thinking clearly. These people prey on the elderly. Whoever helped you with this Clara person, they're manipulating you." There it was, the classic inversion, the turning of protection into accusation. I felt a wave of pity for her, even then. It must have been terrifying for her to realize that I had stepped outside the frame she had built around me, that I had acted in a world she didn't oversee. She stood, pacing. "I'm going to call the social worker," she said. "We'll get this sorted. You'll thank me later." I remained seated, hands folded. "Darling," I said quietly, "you can call whoever you like, but it won't change what I remember." She froze at that word. Remember. It was the one thing she'd tried to strip from me through constant implication that my mind was fraying. "You think this is memory?" she snapped. "This is confusion. You're rewriting things that never happened." "No," I said. "I'm writing down what you hoped I'd forget." For a moment, something almost human flickered in her eyes. Grief, maybe, or recognition. But then she hardened again. She took the letter from my pocket without asking, folded it sharply, and walked out. I knew that by morning the administration would be involved. They came in pairs, like detectives. The facility manager, a thin man with the smile of a public relations brochure, and the social worker with her clipboard of compassion. They asked if I felt safe, if I understood my finances, if I was aware of the changes I had made. Their questions were wrapped in concern, but pride at my competence. I answered each one slowly, precisely, forcing them to note how articulate I was. When they asked if I wanted my daughter present, I said no. That seemed to unsettle them. They scribbled notes, thanked me for my openness, and left. Later, I overheard them talking outside the door. The manager said, "She's lucid enough, but the daughter's influential. We should proceed carefully." It was the kind of sentence that confirmed what I had always known. Truth in such places matters less than hierarchy. For a week afterward, I was under subtle surveillance. The staff became overly attentive, their smiles a little too wide, their questions a little too rehearsed. They asked if I needed help walking to the bathroom, if I wanted someone to sit with me during meals, if I had been sleeping well. Each inquiry carried the same undertone: prove your frailty so we can feel justified. I responded with exaggerated gratitude, thanking them so profusely that it embarrassed them. Manipulation, when used by the powerless, becomes self-defense. Meanwhile, Clara avoided me altogether. I understood why. Helping me had put her at risk. I left small notes for her in the laundry basket, written on scraps of paper torn from the notepad. Short phrases like, "Thank you," "All well," "I remember." I never knew if she found them. Then, one night near Christmas, I was woken by the rustle of someone entering my room. The light from the hall cast a silhouette, a woman's figure, thin, purposeful. It was my daughter. She must have charmed or bribed the night nurse for access. She closed the door quietly and sat in the chair beside my bed. "Mom," she said, voice low, "I'm not your enemy. You're sick and you're being exploited." Her face looked drawn, almost frightened. "You don't understand how complicated this is. You could lose everything." I propped myself up on one elbow. "What exactly is there to lose?" I asked. "A few savings, a house you already emptied, a body you've tried to manage like a project. There's nothing left to take, darling. That's why you're angry." Her expression hardened again. "You're being cruel," she said. "I'm trying to protect you from people who will use you." I wanted to tell her that she had already done the using, but instead I said, "You've mistaken obedience for love." She stood abruptly. "You're not yourself anymore." "No," I said softly. "This is the first time in years I actually am." She left without another word. The next morning, I was informed that Clara had been transferred to another unit indefinitely. Her removal felt like a death. The corridors grew longer, the days thicker. Teresa tried to comfort me by saying that turnover was normal, that nurses came and went. But I knew better. Clara's absence was surgical, precise. They had cut away my only ally. I decided then that silence would no longer suffice. I began documenting everything openly, using the pretense of writing letters. I described the conditions, the manipulations, the small indignities that accumulated into erasure. I addressed the letters to no one, but I wrote them as if to a court that might someday care. I hid them in the binding of my Bible, which the staff respected too much to search. January brought snow, thick and blinding. The windows fogged, and for weeks the world beyond the glass became rumor. During that time, a new social worker named Mr. Dunn arrived, replacing the woman with the clipboard. He was younger, earnest, and inexperienced enough to still believe in rules. On his first visit, he asked me what freedom meant to me. It was such an odd question that I laughed. Freedom, I said, means the right to make a bad decision and live with it. He smiled awkwardly, not sure if I was joking, but I saw something in his eyes, a curiosity that could be cultivated. Over the next few weeks, I fed him small truths cloaked as anecdotes, how residence mail was rerouted, how calls were screened, how signatures were obtained in moments of fatigue. He began taking notes. Perhaps he thought he was conducting a routine assessment. Perhaps he sensed more. Either way, the record grew. It was during one of these visits that my daughter appeared unexpectedly. She walked in mid-conversation, saw his notepad, and froze. "What's this?" she demanded. Dunn stammered something about evaluation protocols. She turned on him, her voice sharp, professional again. "My mother's been through enough. She shouldn't be burdened with interviews. You can contact me for anything you need." Dunn looked at me, uncertain. "Mrs. Layton, would you prefer I leave?" I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I'd prefer you stay." The silence that followed was electric. My daughter's face flushed deep red. She collected her coat and left without another word. Dunn looked shaken, but also, I think, enlightened. He promised to return the following week. That night, the head nurse informed me that my privileges were being reviewed due to heightened agitation. They reinstated the bed alarm, restricted my unsupervised movement, and replaced my key card to the recreation room with a temporary one that didn't work. These were small retaliations, bureaucratic enough to appear procedural, but precise enough to punish. Still, I refused to yield. Each rule became a mirror, reflecting their fear of accountability. The more they tried to confine me, the more deliberate I became. When the nurse read the dinner menu, I requested items not listed simply to assert that choice still existed, even as fiction. When the television droned with its looped optimism, I recited poems under my breath until the words filled the space between the scripted voices. Power can live in the smallest defiance. In February, Clara returned. She found me during evening meds, her eyes tired but fierce. "They transferred me to nights," she said quietly. "I'm not supposed to be here." I asked if she was safe. She shrugged. "I'm fine, but you're being flagged. They think you're trying to sue." I smiled faintly. "Perhaps I am." She leaned closer. "If you're planning anything, do it soon. They're pushing for full guardianship again. Your daughter's been calling daily." The words settled like frost. Full guardianship would erase every legal step I had taken. "Thank you," I said. She squeezed my hand once, quick, then left before anyone noticed. That night, I used the phone. Dean answered groggily, his voice warm with fatigue. "Marjorie," he said, "I wondered when I'd hear from you again." I told him about the renewed guardianship petition. He cursed softly. "They can't override without a competency hearing, but they might fabricate cause. You'll need documentation." I told him about Dunn, the social worker. "Good," he said. "Keep him close. He's a witness, even if he doesn't know it yet." We arranged a plan. He would contact Dunn through official channels, present himself as an auditor. If all went well, there would be a review of the facility's procedures. I thanked him and hung up, my pulse steady. I had become something they couldn't categorize, a woman neither compliant nor combative, simply awake. The review came 2 weeks later. A small delegation arrived, clipboards gleaming, questions polished. They interviewed staff, checked files, even spoke to me briefly. My daughter appeared during the process, her face drawn with irritation, disguised as worry. "You're creating chaos," she hissed when no one was listening. "Do you understand what this does to me?" I almost laughed. "To you," I said, "all I've done is speak." She stared at me with that old mixture of fear and resentment that daughters sometimes reserve for mothers who outlive their usefulness. "You've always been dramatic," she muttered, "even now." "No," I said, smiling faintly. "I'm finally accurate." The review concluded without incident, but something in the air changed. Staff became polite to the point of stiffness. My daughter stopped visiting altogether, communicating instead through curt emails posted on the notice board outside my room. Dunn continued to check on me, though now he seemed wary, perhaps instructed to maintain distance. I could sense the institution closing ranks, yet beneath their caution, a current of unease pulsed. They knew I had slipped beyond their control, even if only symbolically. One evening in March, I stood by the window, watching the snow melt into gray slush along the parking lot. For the first time, I saw the reflection of my face superimposed on the outside world, a ghost hovering above the cars, and I realized that the escalation had reached its peak. They had taken everything that could be taken, yet I remained myself. My will filed, my mind intact, my story preserved. I had become both witness and evidence. Later that night, Clara brought me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of a cottage by a lake, blue shutters, a wooden bench, a rosemary bush by the window. "Dean asked me to give you this," she said. "It's a rental he found in your name. The paperwork's clean." I looked at the photograph until it blurred. "How?" I whispered. She smiled. "You already did the hard part. You remembered who you were." I held that photograph until morning, the paper warming in my hand. Around me, the institution kept humming, lights flickering, doors locking, alarms blinking. But inside, a quiet certainty had settled. They could document, diagnose, and diminish, but they could not unwrite what I had done. The second escalation had not destroyed me. It had clarified me. I was still here, and for the first time in years, the horizon had a direction. The morning I left the Willows was not cinematic. There was no storm, no shouting, no heroic rush through the corridors. It began like any other day. The breakfast cart squeaked down the hall, the smell of oatmeal thick in the air, the intercom blaring some reminder about flu shots. I woke before dawn, fully dressed, my shoes already on, my hair brushed, my hands steady. I remember thinking how strange it was that freedom can start in such ordinary light, in that gray hour when the world hasn't decided whether to be gentle or cruel. The plan had been building quietly for weeks, forming out of small permissions I'd learned to grant myself, to imagine leaving without guilt, to call a friend without asking, to act before explaining. Dean's photograph of the cottage had become both destination and talisman. I kept it folded in my sleeve, the paper soft from handling, the edges creased into something that felt alive. Clara was working the early shift. She met me outside my room, her face pale but resolute. "It's all arranged," she said. "A medical transport will come at 7. You're scheduled for an off-site appointment." She placed a clipboard in my hands. "Officially, I'm escorting you." Her voice trembled slightly. "You have one bag?" I nodded. Inside were a few clothes, the phone, my identification, and the copy of my will. The rest, books, trinkets, photographs, I left deliberately. It felt right that the objects stay behind. They belonged to the woman they had tried to design, the compliant resident who smiled on schedule. We walked down the corridor in silence. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. Other residents dozed in their chairs, faces tilted toward the television's blue glow. I wanted to stop and whisper to them, to say, "It's possible, even now." But I knew words would only confuse them, or worse, endanger them. Liberation, I had learned, was a solitary act. At the nurse's station, the clerk on duty nodded absently, glancing at the form Clara had filled out. "Off-site evaluation," she murmured, stamping it without reading. The sound of that stamp was quieter than a heartbeat, yet it sealed my departure more surely than any revolution could. Outside, the air was sharp and thin. Snow lingered in dirty piles along the curb, and the sky had that washed-out blue that precedes real daylight. The transport van idled by the entrance, its exhaust curling upward like breath. Clara helped me into the back seat, fastened the belt, and pressed an envelope into my hand. "Dean arranged everything," she said. "The lease, the keys, even a small stipend from your pension that he managed to unfreeze. You'll need to stop at the bank first. The driver knows where." I looked at her and saw exhaustion etched deep around her eyes. "You could lose your job," I said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but some losses are lighter than silence." The door closed. The van pulled away. For the first few miles, I couldn't look back. I stared out the window instead, watching the landscape unfold, parking lots, traffic lights, storefronts. The ordinariness of it all stunned me. After months of regulated air and beige walls, even the sight of a man walking his dog felt extravagant. My mind hummed with disbelief. I half expected sirens to rise behind us, the staff to appear in the rearview mirror, waving papers of authority. But no one came. The facility, I realized, was too proud to chase. To admit my escape would be to confess that they had lost control, and control was their religion. At the bank, I waited in line like any other person. The teller, a young woman with hair dyed a defiant shade of green, smiled politely and asked for identification. My hands trembled slightly as I handed her my ID. When she verified my account and slid a stack of crisp bills across the counter, I felt a jolt of vertigo. Money had become abstract to me, something discussed but never touched, a symbol of distance between my daughter's decisions and my own will. Holding it again felt like holding breath. I placed the envelope carefully in my bag and thanked the teller, who had no idea she had just witnessed a resurrection. From the bank, we drove to the cottage. It stood by a narrow lake on the edge of town, surrounded by bare trees whose branches rattled softly in the wind. The paint was slightly peeling. The roof sagged at one corner, but to me it looked magnificent. The driver carried my bag to the porch, handed me the keys, and wished me good luck with a smile that was neither curious nor pitying, just decent. When he drove away, the silence settled around me like a living thing. I stood there for a long moment, the key cool in my hand, before unlocking the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and pine. A single window faced the water, and beneath it sat a small wooden table. The simplicity of it undid me. I sank into the nearest chair and pressed my palms against the surface, feeling the grain beneath my skin. For the first time in years, there were no eyes measuring me, no schedule to interpret my movements, no clipped voices deciding what was best. My body, my choices, my silence, they all belong to me again. I cried then, not from grief, but from the shock of inhabiting myself fully. The tears came quietly, like thawing ice. Later that day, Dean arrived. He looked older than I remembered, his beard touched with gray, his coat damp with melted snow. He brought groceries, paperwork, and a small potted rosemary plant. "Clara said you like this scent," he said, placing it on the windowsill. "It helps the place feel alive." I wanted to thank him, to tell him what his help had meant, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I poured us tea, the first cup I had brewed freely in nearly a year. We sat by the window in silence for a while, watching the wind ripple across the lake's surface. Finally, he spoke. "Your daughter called me," he said. "She's furious, but she can't reverse anything. The will stands, and you're legally autonomous." I nodded. "Let her be angry," I said. "Anger will keep her company better than I ever could." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw relief rather than pity in someone's eyes. When he left, dusk was falling. I lit a lamp and walked slowly through the small rooms, the bedroom with its narrow bed, the kitchen with its worn tiles, the living room with its cracked mirror. I found myself speaking aloud, as if addressing the walls. "This is mine, all of it." The house seemed to listen. I opened the back door and stepped outside. The lake reflected the faint pink of sunset, and the air smelled clean, metallic, alive. My breath fogged before me. I thought of all the times I had been told I was fragile, incapable, dependent. How easily those words had colonized my sense of self. Standing there, I realized that fragility was never the opposite of strength. It was the raw material of endurance. I went inside and unpacked. Each item I placed felt like an act of reclamation. The folded cardigan, the small notebook, the photo of my husband I had managed to keep. When I reached the envelope of money, I hesitated. I took out a few bills and placed them in a jar by the window. The rest I locked away. Old habits of caution die slowly. Then I sat down to write a letter. It wasn't to my daughter, not exactly. It was to the version of her who might one day understand. "I forgive you," I wrote, "but not because you asked. I forgive you because I don't want your fear to live inside me anymore." I left the letter unsigned. Some truths don't need witnesses. That night, sleep came fitfully. I woke often, half expecting alarms or footsteps, but each time the only sound was the gentle tapping of branches against the window. Sometime after midnight, I got up and brewed tea. The house was completely still. I stood at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and thought of all the women still inside the willows, their voices muffled, their names gradually becoming symptoms. I couldn't save them, but perhaps I could testify for them. I decided then that my story would not end in secrecy. I would write it all down, the manipulation, the erasure, the theft of agency disguised as care. It wouldn't be a manifesto. I had no interest in vengeance. It would be a record, an antidote to forgetting. By morning, the decision had settled into my bones. I began writing in long, steady sentences, refusing to rush. Each page felt like breathing after years underwater. I described the hospital, the forms, the voices that spoke about me as though I were furniture. I wrote about Ruth and Teresa and Clara, about my daughter's voice twisting love into obligation. I wrote until my hand cramped, then wrote some more. When I finished, I stacked the pages neatly and set them beside the rosemary plant. Outside, the sun had risen fully, scattering light across the lake. The reflection was so bright, it hurt my eyes. Sometime later, a car pulled into the gravel drive. It was my daughter. She must have found the address through the bank records. I watched from the window as she hesitated before approaching the door, her breath visible in the cold air. I could have pretended not to see her, but something in me needed to close the circle. I opened the door before she could knock. Her expression was a complicated mixture of anger, shock, and, perhaps, relief. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "you shouldn't be here alone." I smiled. "I am not alone. I'm with myself, and that's more company than I've had in years." She looked past me into the small room, at the table, the lamp, the plant. "It's so small," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "Small things are easier to fill with truth." For a long moment we stood facing each other. She seemed to age in front of me, the mask of competence sliding away to reveal a daughter lost in her own good intentions. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said finally. "I know," I replied, "but you did, and now we both live with that." She began to cry softly, covering her mouth with her hand. I felt no triumph, only a deep quiet. "You'll be all right," I said. "Go live your life. I'll live mine." She nodded, wiped her eyes, and left without another word. I watched her car disappear down the road until the sound faded completely. When the silence returned, it was vast, but not empty. I sat down again by the window, the rosemary brushing lightly against the glass. The lake shimmered in the pale light. I whispered to myself, "This is the sound of no one deciding for me." The phrase felt like a prayer, and though my hand still trembled slightly from the adrenaline of confrontation, inside I was utterly still. The world beyond the cottage could carry on with its illusions of control, its polite tyrannies of care. Here, in this small place by the water, I had chosen something larger than safety. I had chosen to belong to myself. The lake changed color with the months, first silver, then deep blue, then a strange green that reminded me of bottle glass left in the sun, and in those shifting shades I learned the rhythm of solitude again. The first weeks after my daughter's visit were filled with a peculiar quietness, not emptiness exactly, but the kind of silence that arrives when every external command has ceased, when you wake in the morning and realize there is no one waiting to record your mood or adjust your pillows or chart your appetite. I learned the difference between isolation and privacy. Isolation is imposed, privacy is earned, and in the small cottage by the lake, I began to earn mine back 1 hour at a time. I made tea without supervision, chose my meals according to whim, read late into the night, and when I tired of reading, I simply sat by the window, listening to the reeds rustle. At first, every unmonitored moment felt almost illicit, as though freedom itself might be revoked if I enjoyed it too obviously. But slowly that superstition faded, and what replaced it was not euphoria, but something sturdier, composure. Freedom, I discovered, is less an explosion than a deep, steadying breath. News from the world trickled in through the radio, and the occasional newspaper delivered by the mailman, who always addressed me as Ms. Layton with respectful formality. He had no idea who I had been or what had happened, and that anonymity was a mercy. Once, in late spring, a letter arrived from Clara, postmarked from another city. She had found work in a rehabilitation center closer to her family. Her handwriting was hurried, but unmistakably hers. "I think of you when I see women arguing their way back into their own names," she wrote. "The rosemary you planted, I hope it's still alive." I pressed the letter to my face and inhaled the faint scent of ink and paper, the human trace of connection. I wrote back, telling her that the plant had grown taller than the windowsill, and that every time I brushed against it, the air filled with a smell both sharp and sweet, like memory refusing to fade. I began to write regularly then, not just letters, but pages of recollection, long, unbroken narratives about life inside the willows, about the strange hierarchies of kindness, about how easy it is for care to slide into control. I wrote not for publication, but for clarity, for the act of setting things in order. Writing became the architecture of my piece. I described Ruth's locket and Teresa's sarcasm, the fluorescent buzz in the hallways, the soft tyranny of paperwork, the way the nurses called us sweetheart, as if tenderness were a leash. I described the day I walked out, not as triumph, but as reclamation. Sometimes I worried that memory might distort things, but then I remembered that distortion is what they had used against me. And so even if my recall leaned toward poetry, it was still truer than the institutional reports that reduced a lifetime to a diagnosis code. In early summer, my daughter sent a short letter. It was brief, polite, and careful. She wrote that she was glad I was safe, that she hoped the cottage suited me, that she was sorry things became so complicated. There was no mention of forgiveness, no acknowledgement of the harm, but there was something brittle in her phrasing that suggested the first cracks of understanding. I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer with no intention of responding. Reconciliation is not always the same as return. Sometimes the truest reconciliation is distance maintained without bitterness. I wanted her to live unburdened by the need for my approval, just as I wished to live unburdened by her management of my existence. Love, stripped of ownership, is lighter. The cottage became a kind of quiet kingdom. I learned to mend things again, to cook for one without apology, to hang laundry in the open air. I made friends with the neighbor across the road, a widow named Agnes, who shared her garden's tomatoes and who never asked too many questions. Once, as we drank coffee on her porch, she said, "You have the look of someone who's fought a long battle and won it quietly." I smiled and said, "I didn't win. I just stopped surrendering." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. People like her, those who have lived long enough to see the cycle of dependence reversed, understand that victory often looks like calm rather than conquest. As the year turned again, I found myself walking more. The path around the lake became my confessional, each step a sentence, each breeze a punctuation mark. Some days I spoke aloud, telling the water what I couldn't tell anyone else. The guilt of having stayed silent for so long, the strange mixture of pity and anger I still felt for my daughter, the ache of knowing that many women would never find a way out as I had. The wind never answered, but it listened perfectly. Listening, I realized, is the purest form of care, and that is what had been stolen from us at the Willows, the right to be listened to as full human beings rather than problems to be solved. One morning in late autumn, a local journalist left a note at my door. Dean must have told her something about my case. She wanted to write about the growing issue of elder autonomy. For a moment, I considered declining. I had no appetite for spectacle or pity, but then I thought of Ruth and Teresa and all the others whose stories would never be heard, whose names would vanish beneath the headings of Case Resolved. So I agreed to speak on one condition: no photographs, no dramatics, just truth. She came the next day, young and sharp-eyed, her recorder trembling slightly in her hand. I told her everything, not with anger but with precision, describing the ordinary cruelty of condescension, the way an institution can smother you with politeness while stealing your voice. When she asked how I found the courage to act, I said simply, I remembered that remembering is a kind of resistance. The article was published a month later. It caused a small stir, nothing revolutionary, just a few letters to the editor, a promise of an investigation, a brief discussion on a radio show. But that was enough. I hadn't wanted revenge. I had wanted acknowledgement. The Willows would continue, perhaps a little more careful, a little less confident in its benevolence. I had left a crack in the facade, and through that crack, others might see daylight. That was enough legacy for me. The seasons continued to turn. I turned 83, then 84. My hands grew thinner, my steps slower, but my mind stayed clear, sharpened by the discipline of reflection. I found myself speaking occasionally to the women I had left behind, as though they could hear me across distance. "Ruth," I would say into the wind, "they will not write the last sentence for us." I didn't know if it mattered, but it steadied me. Sometimes at dusk, when the sky was the color of ash and the lake mirrored the first stars, I would imagine another woman sitting in some institutional bed somewhere, hearing the same condescending words I once heard. She won't remember anyway. And I wanted to send a message across the silence, something small and strong enough to outlive both of us. Remember everything, even when they tell you not to, especially then. Now, in the evenings, I sit at the same window where I first placed the rosemary plant. Its leaves brush against the glass when the wind rises, and the scent fills the room with a quiet fierceness. I often think of my life as divided not by years, but by the sound of two doors closing, the one at the Willows that sealed me in, and the one here that I closed myself. Between those doors lies everything I had to unlearn about obedience, dependence, and the lie of being taken care of. Freedom, I know now, is not given. It is remembered, like language once lost, returning on the tongue. I am not fearless. I am seasoned. Fear still visits, but I pour it tea and let it sit a while until it grows bored and leaves. When night falls, I light a candle and read what I have written. Sometimes I edit a line. Sometimes I add a memory. The manuscript grows thicker, heavy with confession, but also with clarity. I intend to leave it behind as my real will, a testament not of possessions, but of perception. Perhaps someday, another woman, reading it from her own narrow bed, will see herself in these pages and realize she, too, is still in there, thinking, remembering, waiting for the moment when remembering becomes action. And when the light in the cottage dims and the wind presses harder against the glass, I whisper one final benediction into the room, not as prayer, but as instruction. No one decides for you anymore, not even time. Then I sit back, listening to the rustle of the rosemary, to the sound of my own breath steady and unmonitored, and I understand that the story has not ended. It has simply reached the quiet truth that every woman who survives erasure eventually learns that peace, when finally found, is not the absence of noise, but the ownership of silence.